to the Remington Podcast, where we take a deep dive into all things ammunition. I'm your host, Audrey Mays, and today I'm sitting down with ballistics engineer Jimmy Lawrence.
Happy to be here.
We're here discussing some terms, some terminology that we may take for granted here in the ammunition industry that, maybe we need to run down a little bit and, make sure that people understand exactly what we're talking about when we use these words.
Yeah, not just to sit down and read through the glossary and define everything, but we do commonly run past certain words that may have never been spoken in some of these circles. And a lot of them people will be familiar with, but getting down to the root of why we use some of these words for the last, in some cases, several hundred years.
Yeah.
And we're still using them in a technical standpoint. I thought it would make a fun conversation.
Yeah, and sometimes, we don't really research like the root of the words that we use. I find it really interesting. Maybe that's because I'm a little nerdy, but like, for example, the word ammunition comes from somewhere. It's like no one just made up the word ammunition. So like, let's break that down a little bit. I know that you researched it before you came in here.
Yeah. People hear the word munitions depot, and ammunition and figure there's some kind of a link there.
Mm-hmm. There's got to be some root.
Yeah. Originally, I think the word munitio was fortification, and the French turned that into munitions in terms of the things they would put in the fortifications.
Okay. Yeah.
And then they called the munitions la ammunition, or la munitions, which got shortened into ammunition. Because you hear la munition, then they assume it's a L apostrophe ammunition. So that was a weird one. And then, like, we're going to have a bunch of these today where it was a French word that got translated throughout Europe, especially during the Napoleonic Wars.
And then, comes over to America, and we call it ammo.
Ammo.
Yep.
That's the word now.
We like to shorten everything. So when we went through the history of a cartridge, we did notice that there was a lot of French influence on small arms, firearms, and stuff like that. So it makes sense that a lot of the words we're going to go through started in France.
Yeah. So just a quick note there. At that point in time, and by that point in time, I mean around 1800. So we're on the peak of colonial empires, these powers of the world that are fighting it out. And almost everything Navy related is centric to England and the Crown. And almost everything land-based is centric to France, because that's where not only originally the king and court of France had focused because they were good at it, but then subsequently Napoleon. So a lot of the small arms development, including perfecting what they considered the best powders, black powders, how to package up ammo and get it to an army, even the things like logistics. We talk about how good the Romans were at moving an army across a large area. And France was that for the 1800s. So even our route from a propellant making standpoint in the last couple hundred years, it was the court chemist, Lavoisier lost his head. His apprentice was E.I. DuPont, who got away and ran away to America and started making gunpowder. So DuPont and Remington have a history that lasted together for 70-ish years. And so that was all rooted back into France's excellence at making all things small arms.
So we have a deep root in France.
Something like that.
So do all our words. I know another one. I think the next on our list to hit is cartridge, which sounds deeply American to me. So can you hit that?
Well, we've used it so commonly. It does rhyme with partridge, which is a very English word, right? But it's another one that came through France. And as you talk about ammunition, a cartridge is kind of the root piece of what makes ammo. So looking at where that started, I found that it actually went further back than I would have guessed. It starts with Latin for paper, which is carta.
Okay, so way back when.
Cartography, anything like that. And then there was an Italian word that the French borrowed called cartuccio, which was a small roll of paper. And how that gets from paper to cartridge is that they used to pack up the propellant charges. So one single charge of propellant for a pistol was just a powder bag, and that was called a cartridge. So you'd load cartridge and then a ball or a bullet. We'll get to that one. And there was your round of ammunition ready to fire. So eventually they started including the ball in the paper patch or cartridge, and then it was a paper cartridge. In the 1860s, we started seeing it used much more commonly as an entire round of ammunition.
So roll of paper to paper cartridge
was because they'd pre-roll the paper and then fill it with powder and then twist it off. And so there's your cartridge. And the roll of paper also became used, the word cartridge, for film.
Yes.
A cartridge of film back when people took pictures that way.
Back when film was film.
Printer cartridge. This is a little pouch of powder, but we were thinking of a single reload for your printer. I would have guessed that all those terms cartridge were all kind of parallel and similar, but it seems like they all came from the word cartridge in terms of guns and ammo. So I thought that one was kind of neat.
Yeah, it is interesting because, you think the way that we use cartridge, like loaded cartridge or full cartridge, that's how we get that mix up, right? Because
the entire package now we consider a cartridge.
So the fully loaded round.
A full loaded round has a cartridge case, a bullet, and then it's filled with propellant and it contains a primer. And everyone at all walks of the sporting world at some point has referred to a loaded round as a bullet and has referred to a bullet as a slug and the cartridge case as a shell or a bullet shell. And then none of them are wrong. And that's kind of one of my main points. And when I talk about words like these, we do have the most accurate and technically correct version. But if you want to call a loaded round a bullet, I'm not going to start a fight about it. Some people do.
Yeah. Well, it's slang.
Yep.
We have slang in the English language a lot. So.
And that's a very powerful part of how some of these words change. Because you give a soldier in the field a vocabulary, and they're going to wind up using it or misusing it. And we'll get into some examples of those too.
So. Yeah. So you brought up shell in terms of cartridge. So I know that's the next one that we wanted to hit. So can you dive into that one a little bit?
Yeah. Fun fact about Remington is we officially refer to cartridge cases as shells on the floor.
Yep.
So we have the shell area. We've had a lot of new eyes come in and declare that wrong to the point where they'd even go hang up new signs that this is the case area, which isn't incorrect. The cartridge case is the brass component that holds propellant and then crimps around the bullet. But going back to the beginning of Remington in terms of ammunition, the Union Metallic Cartridge Company, they were always calling it a shell. So that goes back to, again, Civil War, just a little bit before when they first came up with exploding artillery. A hollowed out iron cannonball that was filled with gunpowder was an artillery shell. So it was emptied, filled full of energetics, and you'd fire it and it'd go blow up over there. So a lot of what we're used to in modern artillery, they started calling the entire loaded round a shell because they had either solid iron balls like in naval guns, or once they went to Parrott rifles in the field, they would have a shell as the projectile. And when they started including the cartridge case with that as a loaded round further towards the end of the century, the whole round started being called a shell because it was an explosive projectile.
Okay.
From that, it actually got broken apart with kind of that slang and misuse we talked about, and then being applied to the brass component. And looking back how far that went is actually tough. But if you go back into some of our really old UMC catalogs or packaging back to the 1900s and earlier, the box of ammunition you'd buy actually came with instructions on the back of how to take your fired case and clean it out and deprime it in hot soapy water so that it could be reloaded later without being corroded. In every one of those instances from UMC, they referred to it as the shell. So you fire your ammunition, you pick up your shells off the ground, you clean them in hot soapy water. We've been using that word here for a long time.
Yeah. Well, I feel like when you go to the range, be it like indoor or outdoor, there are signs that say pick up your shells.
Yeah.
That's what I'm used to at least. So
empties.
Yeah.
And shot shell, we call them holes. Like the hull of a walnut, because they are much more shell-like. It's a plastic tube.
Right.
But for whatever reason, we had stuck with that one, and so many other people in the industry followed the military lexicon of calling it a case.
Okay.
And similar to the difference between up till fairly recently, 10 years ago, we refer to FMJ bullets as metal case, and always did all the way back into the 1800s. The military had adopted the term full metal jacket. We had stuck with metal case up until 2015-ish. They decided to kind of unify with the industry and go with FMJ. It was one of those things that it wasn't wrong or different. It just went so far back into our history that we didn't realize we were the only ones still doing it.
Yeah. That's interesting. So, like, again, we move on to this next one, which is kind of up for debate sometimes, like round. Okay. The word we're looking for here is round, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. But some people say a cartridge is a round. Some people say you have to say loaded round if you're talking about the whole thing. When we were talking about it, we got confused because you were trying to say like number.
Well, how many is a round of ammunition?
Right.
Because when I was little, and the reason I was thinking this was maybe confusing, and it may be confusing for some. When I was little and I heard someone say, go fire a round of ammunition, I just immediately assumed it meant something like a full magazine.
Yeah.
So I can remember asking the question, how much is one round? How much is one volley? Would be a more accurate question to figure that out. One round of ammunition is one shot from every person. So this is a military term where if you've got 10 guys
in a volley,
they have 10 rounds of ammunition. Altogether, you got 100 bullets. Right. Cartridges and powder charges and priming charges. But you ask the individual how many rounds he has. It's a collective term because they are fired in volleys. So you go to the bar and you buy a round of drinks. It is only one drink, but it's one for everybody. Right. So that's where I had been confused in the past, because the term a round of anything sounds like it should be more than one. So on the floor, we say a loaded round. Yeah. It's an assembled, fully ready to fire single cartridge of ammunition. Yeah. Okay. And then we got into the conversation. Okay. Well, a round of trap, that's more than one trap. 25 for singles, 25 for handicaps, 50 for doubles. Yeah, exactly. So anyways, I could see why it would be confusing. I've always thought a round was just a single loaded cartridge, which is correct. Yeah. Yeah. But it's interesting that some people could be confused about that. Well, that's why we're here, because there's a lot of these words are going to have been misunderstood. We're not going to hit them all. Right. But you might learn something if you stick with us. Yeah. That's I like that. I like that that thought process, though, behind a volley being a round. And that's why there's multiple in a round. That makes sense. But usually it's one loaded cartridge, people. Well, and again, that dates back to the time when they were fired as volleys. And that was the discipline of how to go fight, was you line up a bunch of guys and you fire all at the same time. Yeah. And then you all reload at the same time. And how many times can you do that before you got to retreat and refill your bag? Back when, that was the way we did wars, back when we fought each other. And then you also brought up another word, which is, I guess, I don't know. A lot of people mix them up. I do this all the time. And people correct me all the time. The difference between a clip and a magazine. Yeah, and that's an easy one to get hung up on. I think I remember the start of that argument, late 90s, early 2000s, people really started to get more and more interested in guns and gun culture. At that point in time, people have a clip for their pistol, and that was something that people would say regularly without getting their head bit off. And it has progressed for the last 15 to 20 years to the point now where almost everyone has figured it out, and you hardly see them mixed up anymore. But it was even in the media, you have seen the high capacity magazine clips and things like that, where they just get attacked by the public. And it's one of those misuses that became so commonplace that it's excusable in my mind. I could give two cares. Yeah, right. But originally, when we sent guys into war with a 5-round bolt action rifle, his fighting ammunition came on clips. So a lot of people are familiar with stripper clips and block clips for the M1 Garand. The Enfield clips held 5. 303 British comes in 5-round clips. And it is literally a metal bent over piece of sheet iron that clips the ammunition together, and you stuff it into your gun. It either stays in the gun or it strips free. And that's what guys refer to as a reload for their rifle. Right. In the military. In the military. And many of these words, we're past the French now. We're into World War I. Yes. French were there, sorry. But we're now into English-speaking terms where these guys come home and they've got a clip for their gun. Now, the 1911 comes along is our example of this. And here's your magazine for that gun. all of a sudden, you're still going to see guys call that a clip because most of them were carrying rifles, and even a detachable box magazine for the last 100 years was pretty commonly referred to as a clip. So the word clip's pretty dang easy to understand. You get over this term that we're forced to use now, this magazine.
Right.
That's a lot of syllables. We call it a mag.
It's a big word.
Where the heck did that come from?
Yeah.
Because you'll hear of powder magazines. We have them here at the plant. And that's actually the root of it. You look at a ship's magazine, a fortress's magazine, and it comes, this is one I had to look up a long time ago. It comes from the Arabic word makhasin, which was a grain silo. So put yourself out in the middle of the desert and you've got some grain. You either traded for it or you grew it, and you need to keep it safe, decently cool, and dry. And so they had these earthenwork silos, and people have seen those in other uses, but their word for it was magazine. And so when propellant became part of their daily usage at the fortresses, they would have this grain silo to store their powder in, keep it cool and dry out of the sun, and make it to where they could use it, longer than letting it get rained on, heat cycled, things we've talked about before. So that term magazine went from storing grains to storing powder. And they kept using the word, but when the French had to adopt it again, they're now talking about their fortresses magazine. And then the English adopted in the Navy. They have a magazine on the ship, which is away from the galley, away from the fire, down in the hold. It's dry and it's safe. So you fast forward into like the battleships. You see if in the war movies or documentaries, you see they got hit in the magazine and it all blew up.
Yeah, sure.
So that was down in the middle of the boat, and that is the storage for all the ammunition for all the guns, whether they're muzzle-loading iron ball cannons or 1650 battleship guns. They're being fed by a magazine. So get back into the sporting world. The lever action repeaters in the late 1800s, that was a tube magazine. They were calling it that. And it was used as a place to store the ammunition ready to fire.
This is all making sense.
Now it's starting to come together.
Yes, yeah.
So you got tube magazines, you got in-block box magazines, and sometimes the clip is a component of the magazine, but the magazine is actually containing the ammunition ready to shoot, especially in a repeating firearm. So we have the clip is most often actually a magazine.
Okay. So, and then I feel like some people even use like the phrase magazine clip.
Yep.
Is that correct?
No.
No. Okay. Gotcha.
They're just trying to be more correct.
Okay.
They don't want, and you'll see that a lot.
Yeah.
People don't want to get it wrong, so they'll use as many words as they can and just kind of stab at it.
To directly describe something because they don't want to get it wrong.
Spent bullet shell.
Okay. Well, yeah.
You've heard that one.
That'll do it. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll stick in your ear. And you'll see that on thumbnails on YouTube and things like that, making a 50-pound brass bell out of bullet shells. A bullet shell's actually a jacket, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, then that's good because I just, maybe it's because of old timey, I don't know. My dad used to call like pistol magazines. He used to call them clips. Empty the clip is what he would say. And it's like, it's not what that is.
How often did your dad empty the clip?
I mean, we go, shooting outside all the time. Just empty the clip. Okay, great.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's kind of the point, is if it's been part of the vocabulary used a certain way for, set your time limit. I'd say 100 years is good for it to become correct. That's why I don't get after people for misspeaking in some of these instances unless they mean something different and used a completely wrong word. That good old-fashioned, that word doesn't mean what you think it means type of situation.
Yeah. Well, let me throw another one at you then.
Okay.
Suppressor and silencer. That's
another classic recent online debate. So suppressor obviously is there to suppress the noise of the gun.
Right.
The muzzle blast. And it slows down muzzle gases. It reduces the audible report from the muzzle. All you're left with is the supersonic crack of the bullet if it is firing that fast. And then a whoosh of subsonic gases coming out. So everyone's happy with the word suppressor. People believe it's correct. And if you use the word silencer, you're feeding into the Hollywood mythology that they make your gun silent.
That it will literally not make a sound.
So English used the term, English being UK, use the term moderator, and some people call it a muffler even. And those are all fine, but where's the word silencer even come from that we would still use it? The guy that invented it called it a silencer. So to me, that's worth respecting. So Maxim, who had invented the Maxim machine gun, had a kid who was also really into guns. So I want to say Hiram was his name, but either way, Maxim's kid invented the silencer, and his patent for the device itself, which he had on a bolt-action Winchester, was called a silencer. So you would have almost put a trademark on that and said, that's what we're going to call it. But he didn't trademark the term. That's just what he named the device. So you get into the ATF regulations, and all of a sudden they're using silencer, and then they start changing it. They say maybe we should call it a suppressor, and you see it wish and wash both ways, and people argue about it. They're both right. We call it a can.
Yeah. Just make things easy. It's just a can.
It's a can.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. I feel like you nailed it on the head when you said Hollywood, because you see Hollywood movies with the cans on the end.
Yeah.
And
we
they
all
pull the
argue
trigger,
with
no noise is made.
We all of us argue with what Hollywood looks at guns like infinite magazines and silent suppressors. And it gets to the point where the entirety of gun culture kind of gangs up on popular views of things that are incorrect.
Right.
It's not right. It's not wrong, but that's how it worked.
Yeah. I mean, like those videos of real, true guys who do action pistol shooting commenting on movies. Like, oh, he should be empty.
DQ'd.
Yep. Things of that nature. There are other words that maybe we should just describe for people in case they haven't gotten the full definition. We do usually define words that we use that like normal people who don't work at Remington should know.
If we remember to slow down, yeah.
Right, exactly. So words like, I mean, for example, ogive.
Yeah, there's several that come from the bullet. So the section of a bullet in front of the groove or cannelure where the dimension of the bore diameter starts tumbling down into a point, and it makes a pointy arch shape is called ogive.
It's an angle. Yes. Or
it's a reducing... It's a reducing of the diameter at a set rate or a parabolic rate. And there's all kinds of mathematical equations go into that. When you get into some of these terms we're about to roll through, we're actually talking about like bullet design and engineering. That word goes back to the French. It's been around so long, all the way back to the development of Spitzer bullet profiles.
Right.
So the word ogive just refers to the curved portion of the profile in front of the cannelure that ends at the méplat. And we see méplat. So the very tip of the bullet has a flat dimension. On a hollow point, it's the dimension across. And so that term méplat came from the geometry side of mathematics, where one side's larger than the other.
Or méplat, which basically just means the tip, like the top of the bullet, right?
It's specifically the flat section of the tip of the bullet.
Specifically the flat section. Okay. So that was next for me, was méplat.
Well, they're right next to each other.
Yeah. And then you mentioned another one, which I wanted to get into, which is cannelure.
Yeah, that one actually has some etymology behind it too. So we call it a groove, we call it a cannelure, we go back and forth. We groove shells and we groove bullets. But if you wanted to look at a modern English word that is directly parallel to the word cannelure, which was from France for use on bullets, is canal or a channel.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
Or a groove or a tube to transport liquid, which would have been the canal, which came from the same root word as the word cane, like reed, which was cane in Latin. And that also became the word for cinnamon, the little tube. So I thought that one was a real fun one. I found it the other day.
Yeah, if you look at a cinnamon stick, like it's basically a tube.
Yep.
So
it's not a cannelure, but it's a cinnamon.
So what is a cannelure? It's just a groove.
There's several uses for them, but a groove that goes around the bullet on or around the bearing surface. So you mostly use them in the modern sense of ammunition to crimp the mouth of the case into.
Okay.
So the groove you see on a finished bullet that's usually segmented, it looks like a teeny tiny little gear or a nail file, something like that. Or it can be a solid cut. And in any instance, it can be there for crimping the mouth of the case into. It can be all the way down on the shank of the bullet, where we would use it to reduce bore drag on a copper solid. You can use them to hold lubricating wax in lead revolver ammo or lead lever action ammo. So a lot of times we have a solid lead bullet with wax entrained in a cantilever behind the actual crimp groove.
Yep.
And all of those uses come back to the same thing. It's just a groove that goes all the way around the bullet.
Channel.
That
makes sense. One word that I like to pick on people a lot for pronouncing or mispronouncing, depending on where you're from, probably, is what I call a sabo.
Yeah. Even
which you're like, that's not right, but I'm like, that's how you say it.
Sabo. It's better than sabbat, which I won't argue with people about. If the only time you've ever seen the word in your entire life has been on a box of sabbat shells for your shotgun, that's probably how you're going to say it. That's how my dad said it.
Right. If that's how you read it, if you've never heard it said before.
He decided one day that it sounded cooler as a French word, because it probably was, so it was sabbat. It's like, still not quite there. But yes, sabot is a French word for shoe or boot, and it's also the root for sabotage. And for some reason, they decided the word sabotage needed to mean that you were going to take your shoe off and throw it in the gears of the big giant machine and break it so you could go home. And I don't know if that word existed before the Industrial Revolution, but that's when it really entered usage. So the root was boot or shoe. And what a sabot is, we kind of skipped that, right?
Yeah.
If you want to send a bullet through a barrel that it doesn't fit, you wrap it in a sabot. So if we've got a 12 gauge bore that's rifled and we want to shoot a 58 caliber slug, we're going to put a plastic sabot around it. And that way the bullet will have a better ballistic coefficient because it's a smaller diameter, but then you can shoot it and it's a sub-bore projectile. So artillery, tanks, deer hunters all use sabots. And even in the old days, we had talked about the Remington accelerators.
Yep.
It was a 30 caliber cartridge with a 55 grain 223 bullet and a little plastic sabot. And it discards at the muzzle and your bullet is free to travel.
Yeah. Kind of similar to a wad.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that's what our AccuTip Sabo slugs, which are like probably one of our best sellers for sure. People love them because they're the best. It's wrapped in a sabot.
That's what the sabot does.
Yep.
And it's a shoe or a boot because it sets around the back of the bullet as such.
Yep. I just love the debate, and people get real hot about it, you know. No, it's a sabbat.
People don't want to be corrected. And especially if it's something that your dad raised you up using a certain.
Yep.
We get back into that. We've been saying it this way for so long, you go away.
Oh, for sure. The clip. Yeah. And then one, actually, this is more of a fun fact that Jimmy shared with me, but I think that everyone should hear this. Grain.
Yeah, how much is 55 grains?
Yeah. So what is a grain?
We're all very familiar with naming our bullet size and bullet weight in grains. A lot of people have moved on from that. In Europe, they're using grams and milligrams, mostly grams, for payloads and things like that. We still control and measure powder or propellant charges in grains. So I, as an engineer, whip up my unit calculator on day one, figure out how much is that. It's 1/7,000th of a pound. So that sounds oddly specific. So at some point in the past, they decided, and this is in the same measurement system as the pound and the ounce. You know, we're not talking about some derivative of a meter.
Yeah, it's not made up.
Well, it is, but
well,
it's made
not
up
like
when?
millimeter. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, millimeters are technically not made up, but it's not American.
Whatever. Some fraction of a meter. It's not that. Yeah.
So I got to digging into that one a while back because it's an apothecary term. What other unit of measurement would we share with the medical industry? You'll see half grain doses of XYZ. And it was all the way back to the days of scales in the market, where obviously you're going to have large chunks of rock and things like that to represent a pound. But to sell something by the grain, you had to pick what the heck that meant. It was actually a single corn of barley. A barley corn, which you'd use malted barley for everything from bread making to beer brewing. And it was a fairly common plant throughout all of Europe that you could standardize that small amount of weight. So at some point in time, some miller somewhere had sat down and counted out how many grains of barley were in a pound. And they decided that it was 7,000, and that's how we're going to standardize that measurement.
Yeah.
So next time you think of a grain of powder, think of one little nugget of beer seeds.
That's so interesting. My brain automatically went to grain of rice. So I guess barley makes more
In
sense.
France?
In France? Yes. But yeah, thanks Jimmy for sitting down with us today and talking about this stuff. I know that some people don't want to ask questions because they don't want to seem like they don't know things, but guys, just reach out and ask. A lot of these words, people Google. You don't need to. We'll give you the answers.
A lot of the answers are on Google, and some of the backstories and extra little tidbits are not there.
Yeah.
You either got to make them up or have found them some other place, like old Remington catalogs.
Exactly. So if you have any other phrases or words that you'd like us to go over, just, let us know.
Yeah, bite the bullet.
Okay, well, there you have it, guys. Remington is on the rise. Like, comment, subscribe, and be sure to share this podcast with your hunting or shooting buddies. If you have any questions for me or Jimmy here, you can email us at podcast@remington.com. Thanks for listening.